Foundation for the future. First, I signed a Wall Street reform bill that will protect consumers and our entire economy from the recklessness and irresponsibility that led to the worst recession since the Great Depression. It's a reform that will help us put a stop to the abusive practices of mortgage lenders and credit card companies and ensure that people get the straight, unvarnished information that they need before they take out a loan or open a credit card. It will bring the shadowy...
You would think that the president of our nation and our Democrat lawmakers would want to do what is in the best interest of our long-term well-being and not saddle our grandchildren with debt that's going to be crushing them.
An economic recession is a period of time in which trade, the stock market, and economic growth slows drastically or begins to move backwards. The late 2000s recession, more commonly known as the Great Recession, greatly affected the United States, causing mass job losses, plummeting wages, and the failure of several major American companies. Although different political groups identified different causes as the main factor of the Great Recession, many people agreed that irresponsible business practices, particularly on Wall Street, caused the stock market to crash. Everyone suffers when the economy is down and doing very poorly. Even though this problem affects everyone, there are very different ideas about how a crisis similar to the one that happened in late 2000 could be kept from happening again. Perhaps the most different views are those of the Tea Party and those of the Liberal Democrats.
So there are two major explanations of what went wrong. One is a kind of macroeconomic policy explanation that has to do with how the Federal Reserve managed interest rates during the first half of the 2000s. And there was a decision taken to keep interest rates quite low during that period. And when you have low interest rate environment, then money tends to flow into various forms of investment and generate bubbles. And in this case, the bubble was in the housing market in the United States. So certainly I think the United States Federal Reserve bears some responsibility for the crisis, the late Greenspan period and early Bernanke period. But the other thing is regulation of the financial system. Clearly there are a whole set of regulatory issues, what we call microeconomic issues in the financial markets that contributed to the crisis. The loan origination process in the financial industry that dealt with residential real estate and commercial real estate. And then you also had the question of what was going on in the investment banking sector. So you had large investment banks like Lehman, which was the precipitating collapse of the crisis that happened in September 2008, which was clearly a weakly regulated institution. And when that collapsed, we saw that a number of other institutions that were engaged in quite risky financial activities were weakly regulated. So I think the macroeconomic stuff is important, but I would put a lot of emphasis on weak regulation during that period as well.
Directly following the initial stock market crash, corporations deemed too big to fail were kept from going out of business through $700 billion in emergency bailout funds. This stimulus gave banks the ability to resume lending and encourage companies to keep their doors open and continue business as usual. This stimulus was extremely controversial, though viewed as necessary by many. However, after the main crisis was averted, there came a debate over how an economic failure similar to the one that had just occurred could be prevented from happening yet again. Many liberals believe that the only way to keep this catastrophe from repeating itself is through government regulation of the economy and of company activity.
That was a lot of the uncertainty that happened in the second and third weeks of September 2008 was that regulators just didn't have the tools to deal with firms of the size of Lehman and AIG facing basically insolvency. There were other things like trading in derivatives, and then there are a whole series of consumer protection issues too that are very important because you had a lot of predatory lending, in my view, during the run-up to the crisis, and there really wasn't a way to protect loan originators from signing loans with individuals who really didn't have the capacity to repay them. So So that contributed to the housing bubble and the foreclosures that were critical to the whole unraveling.
Despite their best effort, the government simply didn't have the right systems to deal with these large banks as they were failing. Although the bailout was a success and kept the economy from collapsing completely, it did not return it to its original state. The damage done by the predatory lending of big banks could not be immediately reversed. This, as well as the dramatic loss in real estate values, were the principal causes of the recession. As home values plummeted, so did the economy. Those with a more liberal perspective of the government tend to believe that with regulation, it would be harder for companies to keep giving unsafe loans and would make it even harder for yet another recession to occur.
Raise taxes on the wealthiest. Anybody that makes over single person makes over 150 a year, family that makes over 250 a year, raise taxes on them.
However, there are those who believe that regulation of the economy is extremely negative and that it stifles innovation and drive to succeed. The conservative voters of America believe that the United States should stay true to its origins and keep free market capitalism alive and well.
I think that the most important thing is just to cut debt by lowering spending, because the higher debt goes, the worse our economy is going to get. So I think that that should be one.
It's not that we need more regulation, we need consistency. The rules keep changing, and particularly we see this with the president. He doesn't seem to understand that things happen, and it's just sort of chaos. And even if he was proposing a more heavy-handed regulation, but was really firm, and people felt confident that it was going to be a consistent environment, you would see growth start to happen. So it's not an issue of more regulation, it's consistent regulation, and regulation that is pro-business.
Some regulations are good, some regulations are bad, but the thing about regulations is it just creates more bureaucracy. So you write the regulations, then you have regulators to enforce it on the private industry, and then there can be corrupt regulators or regulators who are in cahoots with the industry, and then you really get like no regulation, but the government's spending money on it, and then it really takes a path, that's not desirable for the country, and it'll make us less competitive against other countries. So.
Okay. From this distaste of regulation and taxation rose what is now known as the Tea Party, a grassroots organization with a core message of intense fiscal conservatism. This movement immediately came into the spotlight and gained more and more influence and media attention every day.
The Tea Party began as a reaction to the frustration that taxpayers had with the inactivity or the inaction of the Republican Party to stand up for the taxpayers and fiscal conservatism for people. So when Rick Santelli made the suggestion that there should be a Tea Party, a modern-day Tea Party, a group of people called from a Twitter community called Top Conservatives on Twitter started talking about how we should do this. We should make a symbolic gesture that we are unhappy with our lawmakers and that they're no longer serving the interest of the actual middle class taxpayer advocates. So fundamentally, the Tea Party is a platform for the taxpayer to tell our lawmakers, the media, and special interests what we want. Everyone's got their unions, everyone's got their lobbyists. There was nothing for the taxpayer. Now we have a platform for our voice. And fundamentally, it is a fiscally conservative agenda.
Though these may be the stated ideals of the Tea Party, there are many different conceptions about who they are and what they represent. Many would argue that members of the Tea Party have reasonable desires for change in the United States economic policy, though they fail to deliver their message clearly. Unfortunately, many view the Tea Party in a very negative light, referencing the stereotype that they are uneducated and likely to shout at those who disagree with them. The Tea Party has made people such as Bill O'Reilly, Sarah Palin, and Glenn Beck into its most recognized public figures.
I think it's good for the democracy, more voices in the marketplace. I think that's a good thing. I think they forced some dialogue about things that we don't normally talk about. I think the Tea Party has forced us to look at ourselves a little deeper, kind of see who we are. But I think there's a lot of nut jobs that tagged on to the Tea Party, and so I think you see a lot of, like, if you looked initially at the town hall meetings that they had and how they would just scream at people and shout people down. That's not how democracy works. So they're sort of like, we're right and everyone's wrong, and we don't accept anything less than that. And the whole idea in Washington is compromise and working together, and that's not what they seem to be about. Mm-hmm. It's like our way or the highway.
Although some view the Tea Party as hostile, unproductive, and detrimental to the flow of legislative process, the Tea Party argues that while some of its members tarnish its name, their ideals do not reflect social issues, but rather they just want fiscal responsibility in Washington.
Neither the Republicans nor the Democrats have anything to gain from the taxpayers of America banding together and demanding that we be listened to. So you don't have the Republican Party even standing up to defend the image that you get a couple fringe lunatics on the edge of an event with their with a racist sign or some crackpot issue, and the news is focusing on that, and we do our best to defend ourselves and say those people don't represent what we're talking about, but
either way regulation is viewed, both perspectives have their positive and negative aspects. While no one way can solve every single problem, the current system of regulation and increased government involvement has reversed the economic recession, and the economy of the United States has recovered enormously over the past 2 years. While some fear that economic regulation will destroy the capitalistic principles our nation was founded on, the statistics and common sense prove that history will simply repeat itself unless more strict government regulation of the economy is implemented. Though the Tea Party may fear that the country is headed in the wrong direction, it could also be argued that the Tea Party movement has misguided motives, and that the majority of Tea Party voters are perhaps undereducated on the issues facing our nation today. If the wrong candidate were elected president, real harm and perhaps complete economic failure could befall our nation.